Hey, my brother Fayne,
Hey, mhm.
how are you?
I'm good tonight. I'm good
Well,
tonight, Glenn. It's been a while, and it's good to see you. It's good to know that you're still out there. Focusing on issues like this, which makes our democracy just that little bit safer.
it's been a while. I don't think you and I have engaged what pre-COVID.
Yeah, it's been a while. That's been a while. Yeah, a lot of things have taken place.
A lot of things have taken place. You you have almost been my July go-to conversation, right?
Okay.
In terms of taking us through the sojourn of nationhood, nation building. People may not realize, but you were one of the guys who gave me a radio platform,
Mhm.
just to test my voice out there, man.
Glenn,
Yeah,
you were capable, in fact, well prepared for it. You can tell a man who reads, who stays informed. You're always one of those.
well, you have certainly allowed for that. You have provoked me in many ways when we talk about the idea of nation building. One of those progressive thinkers, I would think it sometime at your own demise, right? Because
In a very conservative country, you are absolutely right. It's
yeah,
not the most
so
popular. It's not the most popular place to be, philosophically in the Bahamas.
yeah.
Yes.
But one of the things about being a progressive thinker that you eventually see the world catching up with the thoughts that you are advancing, and you are notwithstanding you did not enter Parliament as we know it.
No.
But God would have it so that you have been spared that place so that you can always maintain a certain level of independence,
Yeah.
a certain level of free thinking, so to speak, uh,
Absolutely.
not having to subject yourself to what is considered mere party lines, and we're the beneficiary of that. Persons may not know, listening, you are a Fayne Thompson. So let me let you introduce yourself, sir. We're having a conversation around the idea of reset. Tonight, hopefully, we dive a little bit into the question of migration, immigration, laying the foundation for it. But we wanted to be a conversation that engages and gives us the capacity to help navigate through what we call these troubling waters, so to speak. But introduce yourself, my brother.
Come on, I appreciate that. Well, Glenn, Glenn, you know a lot about that. Just for those who may not be familiar with me, and I have not been on Facebook active like this for a while, and I appreciate this opportunity. I am essentially a nation builder. I see myself as such. I'm a father, a lawyer, a social commentator from time to time, a talk show host. Sometimes in the past, I consider myself to be a progressive. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm cowed by the fact that the Bahamas is a very conservative place, and persons like myself may not be as popular and as frequent as others, but that's not a problem. I'm also a thinker. I like to understand the world in which I live, and I appreciate when democracy is being tested. The measure and strength of our democracy is the extent to which our democracy can entertain and handle, address dissent or differing points of view. That's how I try to remember, try to recall, try to mark my thinking and where it comes from.
Well, definitely that's an important, and especially as we enter these space, right, Brother Finn, in terms of the social media, the other outlet that we're no longer limited by just what we'll call traditional media, whether it be the radio or television, even though they still play a significant role in the context of nation building,
Mm-hmm.
that democracy, by its very definition, allows for platforms like these, where we don't have to go through certain screens, where we don't have to
Yes.
subject our views to others for approval. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be responsible, because I do think
Yes.
that
Yeah.
democracy, particularly as we grow and develop, requires a greater level of responsibility, require us to consider the weight of what we put into the public spaces, into those domains. And I mentioned you earlier because that is a flavor by which I've come to know you, to meet you, to hear you discuss these things from that perspective. And so the idea of having conversations around these matters that are very sensitive in nature, and rightfully so, that we want to have the kind of thinking that allows for dissent in voice, but at the same time bring us to a place where we can move the country forward. Because I think ultimately that's what governance is about. It doesn't have the luxury of outing every fire, so to speak. It doesn't have the luxury of making decisions simply in a vacuum. That governance is at its best when it has all of the information before it and is able to part a way forward. You're not really a biblical man, but I think you know this way, right? One of the things that made Solomon the great leader that many of us still reference was that the degree to which his governance, his mindset was tested by having to deal with two women who were saying they owned the same baby. And the basis of that was that one decided that the best way to deal with it is to split the baby in half. And we know what ultimately that meant for the life of that baby. And sometimes, Fayne, when you hear these conversations go on, it almost as if the conversation leads us to split the baby in half. You know, I don't want to use the same language, but I don't give a heck about what happens on the other end, right? But leadership has a way to resolve a matter where the life of a thing continues, the meaning, the purpose, the defining of a thing continues. And I believe the Bahamas is at that sort of crossroad. How do we flesh out in this 52nd anniversary? How do we flesh out the significance, the meaning of what the founding fathers fought for, what we as a nation believe? So if you can take a minute or two, Finn, and sort of navigate that space for us. What were the prevailing conditions? What was the environment like? What was it that led us to evolve around this idea of commonwealth, of forward, of upward, and onward together, to carve out a place that was meant to be special for all of us?
Well, it's a fairly broad question, but let me see if I can answer it in ways which I know. First and foremost, let me say that the Bahamas is an experiment in democracy. Like most democracies, they're all an experiment. The extent to which they survive is built essentially on the extent to which, the base upon which they were built. As a student, as a teacher right now of constitutional law, I always tell my students that the emergence of the Bahamas had a lot to do with a number of factors. One, the end of slavery. Two, the transition from a slave society to a subject society, a British subject. From that point to and in the 20th century to a society where certain rights and liberties were being extended to peoples of color around the world, both brown and black and Chinese. That would have been in the 1940s and 1950s. India was liberated, China was liberated, Africa was liberated. On the backs of those changes, on the backs of that greatness, the Bahamas in 1967, a little enclave of archipelagic islands, was liberated. And it was a liberation based on the idea that, all the wars of independence have come before us. So a lot of them were bloody, but the mold that was created was a mold which touted democracy, first past the post, and liberation and equality for all, including African Bahamians. I do not cower when I refer to when I use the expression black Bahamians. I use the term tonight, perhaps in change of the African Bahamian or Black Bahamian. And it was 1967 when the great shift took place politically in the Bahamas. In 1973, it was manifested by majority rule. And when I say majority rule, I shouldn't say, independence 1973, majority rule 1967, 1968. That has had a profound effect on where we find ourselves today. Because the promise of majority rule was the so-called square deal, where Bahamians, especially of African descent, were guaranteed or told that we would craft a democracy, we would craft a society where Black people were equal to whites. That was the core message. It was sometimes a very conservative message and a conservative way shared, because in many ways, Black people were still shy to use the language of race or class, because to do so somehow was to offend our white brothers, which I think is something which still continues in this country today. But from 1973 until today, we've gone through a number of periods. I call it the 25-year period from 73. I shouldn't say 25, but from 73 until about 1992, a period of massive economic expansion. The hinterland of the heights of Bahamian society became available to African Bahamians to populate these areas and to assert themselves by a new mantra. Whether we like it or not, the tourist miracle, which emerged as a result of the closure of Cuba in 1959, or would it be 1962, resulted in a boom economy for the Bahamas. That combined with the underground nascent drug economy over the years has given to Bahamians, or gave to Bahamians, over the last few, well, that's 30, 40 years, I should say, because we're reaching a new era now, a lifestyle which was second really to none in the Caribbean for Black people. So beyond that point, we arrived in about 1989, 1990, when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan emerged on the forefront of the world stage, and they pushed a new mantra. And that is what a lot of people refer to as that era of neoliberal economics, or openness. Open your economies, bust them open. Bahamianization, put it aside now for now, because you've won your revolution, you are now free and equal, and let's proceed now to build a different kind of economy where it was based upon foreign direct investment. Well, we've seen what that has done to us since 1992. Glenn, I think you've seen it all. You've seen it. It has been a monumental success for some, but a massive and bigger failure for most. When I say that, we're talking about an economic idea which really has gutted the middle class in the Bahamas. The Black middle class, the white middle class, and of course, the middle class in the Bahamas, because the burden of taxation, the burden of carrying the country was placed upon those people in circumstances where openness really brought with it tremendous pressures and a level of competition, which really you're seeing changes recently in the opportunities and the abilities of the typical African Bahamian to take care of himself and his family. So that's basically the overall picture I like to draw of the Bahamas, and we're now here, and still I think our politicians are grappling with a model of development which seeks to somehow practice what I would call trickle down economics. Trickle down economics. Things will come your way. You just got to be patient. Things will come your way. You just got to be your hope. And hope that things work in a particular way. Trickle down economics, as we know, Glenn, only works for some, not necessarily for all. But in all, we have crafted the Bahamas, which can do much better. And that's where we find ourselves in 2025. And that's just a very rough overview, Glenn.
And it is a rough overview, but a necessary overview. So much to unpack it from it, and that's one of the reasons we don't want to just dive right into the question of immigrations or illegal immigration, because a part of that deals with migration. Migration in the context that we're not Bahamians necessarily because we born it. There's a place called Africa in which we have ties. It does seems to me, Fayne, that as you describe it, it almost seems as if we've come full circle. It almost seems as if those issues almost that confronted our forebears stand still before us. The question of inequality, the question of who we are. It seemed to me almost in some instance, the shift in policies in the United States is almost forcing us to re-identify with our Blackness, our sense of communityness in certain ways. So I don't see those things as not being relevant. I almost see those things as history coming before us to play itself out again. And the benefit of having it is to be able for us to sort of navigate in that way. Let me ask you this, because it seems as if you are implying that somewhere along the line with the emerging of the Reagan policy, the Thatcher policy, that the Bahamas got swooped up in that it abandoned the idea of Bahamianization. What does that mean in terms of?
Well, two important things took place over the last let's say two important things took place over the last 50, 60, maybe 70 years. First was the Cuban Revolution, which resulted in the closure of Cuba and the expansion of the Bahamian economy in ways which theretofore we had not anticipated. And secondly was the emergence in the 1980s of this new mantra of openness. That is to say, development for you and your country is good, but you must do so on the basis that there is an openness, a foreign direct investment, which is placed on the same footing as the footing for Bahamians. So Bahamians and foreigners became equal. In fact, I recall one particular MP referring to the modern Bahamas as referring to Bahamianization as being dead. And that was important, and that's important. Those two events were important. Cuba, because Cuba and its revolution, because it opened up the Bahamas in ways theretofore that were not anticipated. I don't give Stafford Sands credit for all of that. And secondly, the so-called 1980s, when this push to open up third world economies became very strong and very successful. And over the last years, what we've seen is that a tremendous critique has emerged on the backs of that experience. The persons have said, well, has it worked for developing countries? Has it worked for developing countries with massive problems, and one of which being mass immigration? Mm-hmm. Has it opened up the economic base to make it possible for Bahamians to thrive as they have a right to thrive in a society where seemingly so many others are coming in? Because what would be created by the closure of Cuba, and what we created by the boom economy after the 1970s was an economy, Glen, which was voracious, greedy, hungry for labor, cheap, exploitable labor. And what did they do? What did the oligarchs of our country do? They turned to Haiti. And whether they like it or not, sip, sip, glib, glib, and so forth, most political leaders accepted the reality that the super exploitable nature of Haitian labor was the means by which not only to secure a good workforce, but also one which was far more exploitable than the typical Bahamian laborer, and understandably so, because after 1967, 1973, Black Bahamians were not prepared to be treated with disrespect or disdain in the workplace. In many ways, the opening up of our country after independence and majority rule made it possible for the so-called typical Bahamian, the Rolles, Glen, the Thompsons, and so forth, for their children and their families to expand and to do well and to do better. And they were not prepared to take the cheap labor supply, which clearly is in the offing in this country in a huge way, but seemingly now which appears to be dominated by a culture coming from outside. And that's not something new. It's been going on for a long time. But definitely the two big events, the closure of Cuba many, many years ago, the expansion of the country after 1973, and now the so-called, I would say post neoliberal years we've seen where we've been now for the past 50 to 60 years. And the question is, have we done enough? Have we done enough to continue expanding that workforce where young Bahamians can see an opportunity not just to go abroad and to train themselves, but to come back? My daughter, for example, I'm trying real hard, Glen, to get her to consider coming back home for certain opportunities. She keeps saying to me, Daddy, will, and who can pay me? And then she says to me, Daddy, but my labor is much more expensive than the labor which is paid for by people who come from the southern climate, the southern parts of the Bahamas in this region. So that's where we are. We're facing a tremendous challenge right now, and political leaders, I think, are faced with an acute decision. Shall we continue down this neoliberal road? Shall we continue down this road which has caused us to push Bahamianization aside, or shall we look back? Maybe we have to look back to go forward, Glen. And that's basically
and that's really the conversation. And I do think it brings me to this question, and one of the reasons I'm raising this question, because people do have different ideas in terms of what it means to be a Bahamian. Sometimes we associated that to merely blackness, so to speak. But you're a little bit older than me. I do believe that we were first British before we were Bahamian. Am I correct to say that?
That is absolutely correct. But also remember, John Henry Boswell Jr. likes to say he was born free after 1973. We were also slaves up until January 9th, 1973, but slaves whose lives had changed drastically, and the new dispensation was about us. But you're right, we were formerly British subjects of the Queen. We didn't have any independence, any agency to choose to do as we wish. But in 1973, the great change took place. A great political change took place.
And the reason I mention that, because you had at least this arrangement, this coming together. that this idea of Bahamian was not limited to a black Glen Rolle or a black
That
Fayne
is true.
Thompson,
That
that
is
this
true.
idea of Bahamian were open to others.
That's
So
true.
if you were to describe it in that context, as a teacher, as somebody who appreciate history, what would you say to them that this idea of Bahamianization was? Because I think this is a part of what gets us into the question of migration and immigration. How do we get to these spaces where we do have policies that reflect those values? What would you say to us to understand the multi-nature of what it means to be Bahamian, but yet one people?
Well, I think, Glenn, in many ways, we took leave of the original design that was Bahamianization. In 1970, in the 1960s and 1970s, it was about correcting a historical wrong. Black people don't want to talk about it, some of us. African Bahamians don't want to address it, but it was about addressing the needs of African and Black Bahamians. Unashamedly, that was the agenda. But it was cast in a very, very, what I would call conservative, small c way. That is to say, we didn't use the words we didn't use the word Freedom Day on January 10th. We used the language of majority rule. That
Mhm.
was softened to a large extent, I think, because of the nature, the obvious nature, the conservative nature, I think, of PLP leadership at the time. It was not a leadership which was prepared to go the route of a Michael Manley at the time, who was having tremendous difficulties with the Americans because of his assertion of control over the needs of his people and his natural resource base. And you recall the problem that Manley would have had around that time, Michael Manley. And of course, Fidel Castro and the so-called problems that the Cubans have had ever since. These two men were the reasons why the PLP had to march a very, very careful line to power. And it was cast as a victory for majority rule, but really it was about Black people and
Mhm.
change for Black people in this region. Up until 19, up until the late 1980s, unashamedly, we used the language of Bahamianization. That was coded language for an assertion of the rights of the Black majority.
Mhm.
We don't like to admit it, but in my mind, and well, in fact, the truth of the matter is that's exactly what it was. And outside, and in our family homes around the dinner table, that's the language we used. But when we
Mhm.
stepped outside to go to church, we used a different kind of language
Mhm.
because we didn't want to offend. But majority rule lost its footing, I think, in the late 1980s, and most definitely in 1992, when we began to dismantle the core philosophical foundations of what that great change was all about. And
Mhm.
unashamedly, you see, this is the problem. Black Bahamians are not prepared to talk about it as if it's an assertion of a great change. It was an assertion of a great change, and it wasn't exclusive. Because many white Bahamians will tell you, and mulatto Bahamians will tell you, that they benefited tremendously from the great change. I know one
Mhm.
gentleman whose name I won't call, he spoke highly about the fact that, since that PL became the power like doing is making money. And he was not African in any way, not even near it. And he was unashamedly opposed to the PLP, but he was doing well. So
Mhm.
I make a point, which is that 1973 was about Black majority rule, unashamedly. It was
Mhm.
about expanding the opportunities of this country to Black people. Unfortunately, scotch, the breaks took place, and the breaks set in somewhere around 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992.
Well, Fayne, you are certainly laying the way for multiple conversations. I personally wrestle over sometimes getting into this space. These are not easy conversations.
No, they're not. No,
Uh,
they're
um,
not.
to be had. Most of us, or a lot of us, prefer to, for lack of a better term, wallow in the symptoms, not necessarily get to what are the significant systemic national challenges that we face. I do think as we enter this election season, particularly after the 50th anniversary as a nation, that should have been a time for us to pause. Should have been a time when we look back. Should have been a time when we reflect. And I make no apology for it. I am a former police officer, as you know, having the privilege of working in spaces like special branch, working in the court. So there's a certain element of conversation
Mm-hmm.
that drives us in the context of sifting through the noise and getting to the substance of a matter that I believe is important. Measurement 52 years later that we should at least be thinking about when we talk about elections, when we talk about governance, when we talk about where
Mm-hmm.
the country wants to go. And what you are doing is lending us to provoke these ideas to determine where is it that we want to go. Because where we have that determination as a collective people, then it helps us to resolve some of the issue. That helps us to resolve the kind of legislators we want. It helps us to resolve the kind of immigrants or immigration that we want in moving the country forward. Having that background allows us to look into these matters soberly. Let me ask you this in terms of what is now happening, right? We do have it same as if, particularly from the US, this sort of immigration
Yes,
matter that
yes,
is driving the narrative, driving the conversation. In some
yes.
cases, people in the Bahamas sees what is happening in the US as an opportune time for us to relook at our own matter. Uh, uh, Seeing that you use the term black as it relates
Mhm,
to us,
mhm.
how do
Black
you
and brown Bahamians, yes. Black, brown, and white Bahamians, yes.
Okay, how do you measure the present immigration policy and its impact on what you may now define as the black people, whether it be Africa, whether it be the Caribbean? Is there something going on underlying that at least should cause us as a black people to relook at how we conversate, how we deal with each other, how we reflect, or how we flesh out this space? As you mentioned, that was happening in this late 60s, early 70s in Africa and here in the Bahamas.
Boy, Glenn, that in itself is a thesis, not even an essay. To be quite honest, I always begin this conversation in this way. Glenn, I think we may have to do part one and part two of this conversation. But but
We have multiple conversations, right?
yeah, we may have to do part one and part two because I can see myself asking you for a copy of this. Listen, Glenn, it did not begin. Question of migration to the Bahamas did not begin in the 1970s or simply in the 1950s with the closure of Cuba and the explosion of Haitian labor coming from Cuba, where they traditionally went, and shifting their turn to the Bahamas. There's been a relationship in terms of our migratory problems between the Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti for hundreds of years in this region. Haitians didn't just begin traveling to the Bahamas over the last 50, 60, really even 100 years. They've always been coming back and forth, always. In fact, if you read some of the stories there's a very good historian, the son of the Prime Minister, Mr. Davis, I can't remember his first name. He tells a very interesting story about the interconnectedness between the two countries. And the same applies to Cuba. The most recent developments which have been taking place are twofold. One, over the last 50, 60, maybe 70 years, Castro took power in 1959. It made it impossible for Cubans to move freely as they did theretofore between Cuba and the United States. And the opportunities in Cuba naturally went south as a result of the embargo imposed by the United States government. The problem with Haiti has always been traditionally an anti-black bias by the United States and its oligarchs as it relates to Haitians traveling into the United States. That's not something that's not something new. That's something that we can see in the differences of the policy which were applied towards the Haitians as opposed to the Cubans when they took flight in the high seas on their way to the United States. The Haitians were returned. The Cubans were embraced by the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy of the Americans, which says once you hit American land and you come from that communist country, you can stay. So we've seen that to be historically the case. What else has happened in this particular region? The Bahamas has boomed. And Haitian labor has looked at the Bahamas and said, okay, tell you what now, even though back when the revolution took place, Bahamians fled to Haiti for freedom and protection. We must now flee our country and go through the Bahamas and maybe into the Bahamas for protection and a better way of life. That is the big change that has taken place. Haitian migratory patterns have changed, and they've changed drastically. So much so, and of course, what else has happened? The big, attractive, booming Bahamian economy over the last 50 to 60 years has a voracious appetite for Haitian labor, which is considered to be the best kind of labor in the Bahamas, bar none. Business houses will tell you the truth. If you ask them, they'll tell you the truth. They're black Bahamians and white Bahamians alike. On that question, there's no issue of race. In that context, the Bahamas finds itself in a dogfight to provide the needs for an economy which heretofore has been expanding and so forth, but at the same time having to deal with the massive responsibility of irregular migration. I don't like to use the word illegal immigration because technically ain't no such thing, unless of course you go before a court and you are convicted, in which case you would be convicted of an offense, not an illegal immigrant. So that's basically how we've gotten here. The challenge is, what do we do about it? How do we handle it? How do we deal with it? And this is where the difficulties and the differences come between myself Fayne Thompson, with a bit of a progressive view on the left side of Bahamian society, and what I perceive to be, especially on social media, hundreds and hundreds of Bahamians who display particularly anti-Black sentiments. They don't even realize they're doing it. And bigoted sentiments towards Haitians and Haitians. And let me say something, Glenn, I know, because you may want to ask a quick question. This problem is bigger than we think, because we're not just dealing with irregular persons who come here, otherwise known as illegal immigrants. We're also dealing with a community of Bahamians of Haitian descent who have been here for 100+ years. They're Bahamians. They're Bahamians. And we're also dealing with a group of what I would call regularized Haitians who work here legally and have been here for a long period of time. But for some reason, the debate, when you look at it online, seems to be steeped in all one pot. Haitians, 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 Haitians. And to my mind, that harkens back to a frame of mind which I cast as anti-Blackness. And where does that anti-Blackness comes from? It comes from within ourselves. We see them as somehow being different from us, the other. Creolized, funny, strange people, even though most Bahamians don't realize that half of this country is of Haitian descent. Half of this country, go back into history. But this is what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with the demise of common sense, because to a large extent, Bahamians want to mimic MAGA and the quote-unquote designs of Donald Trump to rid his nation of brown and Black people. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Nowhere in the world has this so-called myth of removing immigrants from your country ever worked anywhere on the planet at any historical moment in time. The Americans have 12 million people over the last 20, 30 years, so supposedly irregular aliens. The British have the same problem. The Germans have the same problem. Any country which is successful attracts cheap, exploitable labor. Now, how do we deal with it? And that's the question. And I said that we deal with it by looking at how at source, what's going on in the source country. And what we can see is the source country is despair, underdevelopment, anti-Blackness. Even the Dominican Republic, it makes it very clear it's antipathy towards Haitians. Not just on the Dominican Republic, because we know they massacred people back in the 1950s. About 15,000 Haitians were massacred in a river. We're talking about a pervasive state of mind led by politicians in the Caribbean towards Haitians. Now, you remember we don't have a monolith in the Bahamas. We got a huge population of Haitian Bahamians. You may not identify them anymore nowadays because their English is as perfect as ours and sometimes much better. But I'm telling you that we are monolithing these people, and it's not a monolith. The problem that we have with illegal Haitian immigration to this country is not as big as the way in which it has been blown up. Bigotry, and especially now, I guess the election season is opening up, and they're trying to demonize Mr. Davis. And for some reason, the politicians not the politicians, the public rhetoric has become plastered with all sorts of stories, which are designed to demonize, again, Haitians as a monolith, not illegal Haitian immigration. This is the problem. And this has been the case that I've known this and I've observed this about politics. Glenn, I can't be that way. Glenn, if it means being one of the good guys and holding the line and bashing Haitians, it ain't gonna happen with me.
But Fayne, listen, one of the reasons I wanted to begin with you, because you have sojourned this part. Your conversations have been loaded with history, and this is not. As we navigate this conversation, I do think that there is a distinction that has to be made, and I do think that there are moments when those distinctions have to be clearly defined.
Yes,
I do think, however, Fayne, if we do it without the benefit of history, if we do it without the benefit of understanding, again, I don't want to be too biblical to you, but one of the parables or one of the stories that Jesus told was when they asked about that, how did these trees get connected? How did they, and their thing to Jesus was, let's pull it up, man. Let's just pull it up. And he said, no. If you pull it up now without understanding the connectivity of the roots, then you are going to pull up both this and that. And so I do believe, and so I'm not having this conversation to just fall on one side or the other. I do think there's a responsibility that comes with these matters. in the one hand, to respond to the true expression of what people feel.
Yes,
You
behavior
rightfully
suggestive.
mentioned that,
Mhm.
that this is a reality of what people feel. And
Mhm.
part of it can be what you just said. In the 80s, we abandoned the idea of what our economic model will look like.
Yes, yes.
We
We,
turned
we,
to a
we we forgot.
model,
That's right. Our
and we
openness.
turned to an
Get a
economic
country away. Get a
model,
country away. Yeah,
and
yeah.
we turned to an economic model that enslaved us in the first place,
That's right.
where
That's
the
right.
question of labor would be the driving force, where
Hmm.
those who didn't find themselves in political office may have the greater power, say, in terms of the policies, right? I told someone the other day, I said it was in clear view, and I don't say this in the context of politics. I'm trying to navigate these spaces so that me nor you be taken in that space, even though you can't avoid it. But we had legislation passed that gave way to say, if you enter the Bahamas and you can invest
Yes,
$250,000, then
yes.
that will put you on a pathway,
To
not only
citizenship.
residency, but
That's
to
right.
citizenship.
Yes. In
You
fact,
know?
the International Land Holdings Act, upon the repeal, the unwise repeal of the Immovable Properties Act, one of the greatest things created by the PLP, whether they like it or not, was the conception of an idea to protect Bahamian assets. When Sir Lyndon died, his son forgot. I'll say it like that. His
Well,
son
well,
forgot.
well, we will get into that because I do believe a part of the rebalancing, a part of
Yeah,
the way in which you restore this idea, because maybe I'm naive, but I do believe in the idea of Bahamianization. I do,
absolutely,
I do believe
absolutely.
that the Bahamas have an opportunity to be this unique place.
But then trouble is the idea of motherization, and he talks it very openly. He don't hide it. Huh? Look, this is what he's doing, right? He's trying to make America great again. Well, we know what that really means. He really
Mhm.
wants to do some things to return America to a place where he was more comfortable in the 1950s and 40s. That wasn't a good place for Black people. But we understand his motivation. We understand what he's trying to achieve. But yet Bahamians somehow feel, oh, okay, well, as long as they keep coming. And I applaud, for example, the passing of some legislation recently to protect the Bahamian people. The International Adjudication Act, the Land Registration Act, the Mining Act, seemingly small attempts. We need more effort to begin to redesign a Bahamas which protects Bahamians. Unashamedly, we must do that. In fact, foreigners are expecting us to do that. When they come here, they say, well, I don't pay no tax. So what's going on? What's going on? I'm prepared to pay tax because I don't want to pay tax in the two countries if I want to live in the Bahamas. We have to begin to act. We have to begin to straighten our backs and act as if this is our country to be protected.
Well,
And,
that's
and,
the
and
conversation, and really a part of that is the question of migration, and that's why
yes, yes,
that's why I asked you the question, or said to you earlier, or suggested to you that the early construct of the Bahamas was not limited to Black people.
no, it wasn't. No, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
The early construct of the Bahamas was based on a particular idea, this
Yes.
idea of freedom, this idea of independence, this idea of commonwealth, this idea of collective responsibility in that regard. And I do think, having entered into this new phase, Fayne, one of the questions that we're going to have to revisit is that what will that Bahamas look like? Do we return to that? Do we value that idea? Do we create the kind of framework by which, even though people may come from different walks of life, that there is no competing of ideas, that
But,
we don't
but
share different values, that all of us are part of this national buy-in. And I believe that's a part of the conversation that has been raised, even as it relates to the question of immigrants. I do believe in some instance the question of Haitians are trumpeted a little bit louder because perhaps of the volume, because of sometime what is saying amongst us in that regard. That does not say it is right. That doesn't say it doesn't need to be addressed, but I believe that government was meant to address these difficult things. And persons like yourself and others can bring a certain perspective to help us address these things in the soberly manner.
yes.
Because I will just simply say it like this: if Trump is right in terms of making America great, then perhaps the extent of the Bahamas can be unlimited in terms of its greatness if we appreciate the degree to which perhaps this was about the
Well,
lifting of a majority, the lifting of a Black people.
you know what? I don't think that it's incompatible with our agenda to move forward and to create a better democracy. That we focus on correcting historical wrongs.
Mhm.
The check, which is owing to people of African descent in the Bahamas, has still not been paid in full.
Yes, sir.
I can
Yes.
say that. I'm gonna take that chance and say that. The
Mhm.
check, the account has still not been settled. All
Mhm.
right. The question of reparations will always be out there, and that's national all by itself.
Yeah.
But the check has still not been paid. That we are now, unfortunately, since the late 1980s, designing a nation which is neutral or neuter. The question as to who is first amongst equals.
Mhm.
The idea of someone being first amongst equals is an old expression. It's known otherwise as inter pares, INTERPARES. The prime minister in the cabinet is first among equals. He has to make the decision to ensure that, for example, the Bahamian people are placed first. We have to find a way to ensure the Bahamian people are maintained as those who are first among equals. And if it means looking at certain sections of our society, not necessarily from a bigoted racial perspective, but from a perspective which is redistributive, one which seeks to correct historical imbalances. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that.
And it's done every day, right? And
Yes, yes, every day.
we'll get a chance over time to
Yes.
dive into those policies. As you mentioned, the Movable Property Act had significant implication. Pieces of legislation shifted this country in very, very fundamental ways. If there was such a thing as a nail in the coffin, lent a nail in the coffin of this idea called Bahamianization. And I believe part of this conversation, the noise and the right noise and the rightful noise is provoking us to reconsider, provoking us to perhaps look again. And having you into this space from a historical perspective was meant to cause us to look again, and clearly you're able to communicate and say to us that there are legacy issues that are involved in the question of migration and immigration. That is an important part of
And
it.
yeah. And I think then we're gonna have to talk. We're gonna have to have that conversation. I
No,
can't do it tonight because
no, no,
I
no, no,
promised
no, no.
promised to be somewhere at 9:30. But what I
But,
will say to you then is I look forward to you having part two. I think you
but,
will find that part one goes over well, but you need
but,
part two.
Well,
And
well, 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 definitely we didn't intend to flesh it out tonight. I just wanted to lay the framework. I wanted to be in the room with somebody who brought a certain perspective to it.
yeah,
And the person listening out there, we're not seeking to lessen the noise out there. I do sometimes believe that political person respond to the noise. But for those of us who bring a certain perspective, I do think that those perspectives and share help to
yeah.
bring the kind of balance, help to bring the kind of governance so that the baby that somebody may cry to split or disregard, that that baby will find life. And the new
Mhm.
Bahamas will emerge with a greater sense of who we are, with our purpose, so that we can fulfill what is said by the founding fathers, see the world, Maximana Faber, and we have an opportunity to do that. And so, Fayne Thompson, final thought. I thank you for coming in.
Well, my
And
final thought is that we look forward to joining you hopefully again, and I thank you for initiating a conversation, re-initiating a conversation you've had with me many times. That's why people don't understand how comfortable we both are with this conversation. We've had this conversation. We're now putting a bit more. We're now fine tuning it. Election time is opening up, so I think we should look again also perhaps at the impact of migration on elections, the impact on culture, society, economics, the impact on our social services, and all of that, and try to put it into context because I really feel for the relationship between the two communities, the Haitian community, which is a tripartite community. They are Haitian Bahamians, they are regular workers, and then they are illegals. There's no monolithic solution for that. We have to look at those communities to find a more humane way to have this conversation. We must discourage our colleagues and friends and citizens online from using the most vile anti-Black language that Black people could use for each other. It is disgusting.
Mhm.
Some of it, not all of it. Thank you very much, Glenn. It's been a
Thank you
pleasure.
for having us. Thank you for sharing. And hey, persons, please, my number is 449-8000. Fayne has consented. Hopefully, we could do this next week, Tuesday, God's willing, if his date is clear. If you could do that, we want to be consistent in that. We'll give our number. Persons may even want to chime in, Fayne, as we have these
That's
conversations.
fine. Fine. Fine.
So
Absolutely.
we don't mind engaging. 449-8000. If you get a chance to listen to this, send your question. Hopefully, I'll propose some to Fayne next time if he's available next week, Tuesday, 8 o'clock. We want to continue this question of migration, immigration, look at it as total as we can, and so that we can move this country forward. I do believe that the country is in need of another push, but that requires a right and a proper response to the challenges that we face. Fayne
Glenn,
Thompson, y'all.
Glenn, we impacted the public debate when KCX was alive and others were. They did not know what we were doing. But
Yes,
I'm pretty certain that a whole bunch of young women and men listened intently. And this conversation can only inure to the benefit of our people. But I appreciate the time.
absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Good night, Glenn.
Thank you.